Okay. Well, this morning I was thinking, this is a very intensive course. You're bombarded with a lot of information, but of course no one expects you to understand all this or to remember all this. I mean, there's just no way. But it's more a way of hearing it, maybe for the first time, maybe you've heard it before. Anyway, so next time you hear it again, there's a better understanding. Every time you hear this, there's just a better understanding. This is what the study of Dharma, and I said it's not just academic study. Study means kind of an analysis that is meant to be also not just knowing the facts, but to be able to apply it and to really bring forth some changes. So every time one hears this, in the context here or actually receiving teachings by a lama and so forth, there's always a slight change. So I hope it's not too overwhelming for you, all this information, but I'd like you to just take in whatever you can and leave the rest. Okay? Yes?
My question is about the order of the four noble truths.
Yes?
Because I learned it a bit different.
Oh, we come to the order. The order will be explained in the text, the general meaning, which is at the end. So we'll discuss the order again. So please keep that question until then, and hopefully it'll be clear. Okay. Anyway, so today I'll speak about karma, and again, a lot of information with regard to karma. Of course, karma is very, very complicated in itself, so not surprising that there's so many different ways of looking at it. But hopefully at the end, without remembering all the different categories, you get a sense of this kind of law of cause and effect, this particular aspect of a law of cause of the law of cause and effect, and a sense that whatever we do, whatever action we engage in, it's a cause which leads to a certain result, which we have to experience. Okay. Now, what we've discussed so far is the first truth, the truth of suffering, explaining just the fact of all the problems and difficulties that we experience in general. Then more specific kind of difficulties, problems with regard to not just this life, but also next lives. And the fact that even our happiness, what we ordinarily regard as happiness, what we strive for, what we are attached to, even that is actually said to be a type of suffering, or maybe a relief from a worse type of suffering, but in the nature, nonetheless in the nature of suffering. So kind of, you can almost say it's a type of suffering in itself, though we wouldn't call it such. So I don't think this is so hard to understand. It may be initially a little overwhelming, again, kind of overwhelming. Oh my God, that's my situation. I don't think so. But it's not meant to discourage anyone. It's not meant to be pessimistic, but rather to be realistic, and then to face life in a slightly different way, from the point of view of just understanding the situation, understanding our predicament, then to be able to face negative situations, because we don't expect happiness to always arise. We don't expect everything to go well. In a sense, personal for me, if I hear about the truth of suffering, about the different types of sufferings, I'm less surprised when things go wrong. Of course, it's to be expected. This is samsara, this is cyclic existence, it's in the nature of suffering. As long as I don't attain liberation from this state, well, that's to be expected. No big deal. And then there's a courage to face whatever problems arise. And it's like an armor, to use a Tibetan expression. It's kind of like an armor, a kind of protection. So whatever comes, okay, I'm ready, all right. And then utilize it, possibly. Well, first of all, have the courage to face it, and then see, what can I do? How can I use this? How can I make this beneficial to myself and others? Because suffering can actually be used in a very beneficial way. It can be used in the path, any kind of obstacle. So kind of suffering is described as an obstacle to one's practice. So how can I transform it into becoming more kind, becoming more compassionate, more renounced, understanding what's really important in life, and there are a lot of things that are just not that important. They're not important enough to worry about them, to spend so much energy in doing those things. And then, of course, love and compassion. It's a great opportunity. Myself, if I suffer, well, I'm just one person. My suffering is actually quite little in comparison to the summary of all the suffering that other beings experience. If you think about it, other living beings by far outnumber us. And not just do they outnumber us, their problems and difficulties outnumber us. So the problems and difficulties that I experience are nothing in comparison to all the problems and difficulties others experience. So then it gives me another kind of boost in like thinking, okay, so not only do I have to face my own, but I can also do something about the suffering of others. I'll try my best, be open to their problems, listen to their problems. And the funny thing is that when we generate that kind of attitude, okay, so my happiness is really not as important because I'm just one person. Other people's happiness is more important. Their suffering is much more severe because others outnumber me. So with that attitude, then one's own suffering really will be much less because one doesn't focus on it. It's not a big deal any longer. And the suffering of others never affect us in the same way as our own suffering. That's the beauty of it. So sometimes people feel, well, if I think of the suffering of others, I get so depressed. But actually, if you do it with wisdom, and it's not just thinking of the suffering and perceiving that to be permanent and heavy and solid, because that's not what it is. Suffering, like everything else, changes all the time. So when people experience sufferings, it doesn't mean they always experience them. They just experience the ripening of an action in the past, and the good thing is now the action is gone. That negative karma is gone, right? So it's fluid, it's dynamic, it's ever changing. And of course, eventually, everyone will overcome their problems and difficulties. That's the Buddhist idea, that eventually everyone will reach the state of a Buddha. And we can help others, we can be of benefit to others. We don't need to teach them. Preaching and teaching is not a good idea. Just live, teach by example. Be kind, be friendly, be compassionate, be calm, honest to ourselves, honest to others. And then others can see that as an inspiration and act accordingly, and in that way create the causes for more happiness and avoid the causes for suffering. Okay? So the point is really just understanding the suffering nature of reality makes us stronger, more compassionate, and more determined. Okay? But then, of course, just understanding suffering is not sufficient. It's extremely important to understand the cause of suffering. So where does suffering come from, our own and others? Now, as we've heard, it is the misperception of reality, not understanding how phenomena really exist, that lies at, well, the root of all our problems. So therefore, it's important to engage in understanding and trying to generate an understanding of what reality really is. So whenever there's the opportunity to investigate how phenomena really exist, do the things the way they appear to me, do they really exist that way? Or am I deceived by the appearances, and rather there's a different way in which phenomena in actuality really exist? So there are lots of reasonings that are described in different texts, available in English, available in Hebrew. For example, the book How to See Yourself as You Really Are by His Holiness the Dalai Lama has been translated into Hebrew. So that's a very good book that presents all the reasonings for how to establish what reality really is, or how phenomena really exist. So that is the root, that's this misperception, and it can only be counteracted by generating a correct understanding of reality. And then there are all the other afflictions that arise from that misperception of how we ourselves and other phenomena exist. So anger, we discussed that in some detail yesterday. Anger, aversion, resentment, attachment, desire, jealousy, and so forth. So all those, it's a matter of recognizing them, first of all, in our own continuum, and then deciding which one we need to deal with first. And we won't be able to eliminate. Attachment is the hardest. So let's not expect to we can't just stop our attachment. Attachment, it's one of the last things that go. Right? One of the last things that goes away, that is eliminated, basically. In the sense that there are very subtle types of attachment that only once we have reached a very advanced state, are we able to overcome. So we shouldn't worry about that too much. More is more worrisome our anger, jealousy, any kind of aggressive state, any kind of state that is motivated by anger or aggression. So jealousy is a type of anger, being upset with the qualities of another person. I think jealousy is a very important affliction we have to deal with in the 21st century, in particular in the modern world. Because our modern world is based on competitiveness. And, there's not every competitiveness is necessarily negative. There's competitiveness that is positive. When I want to work, I want to do better. If I see other people working really hard, and that inspires me to do the same. I want to be just like them. So you work just as hard. I don't know whether you would call that really competitiveness, but to some degree, yeah, you're also aspired. But inspiration or aspiration has different levels. So it's kind of like because they do it, you want to do it yourself. So that's a kind of competitiveness, and that's not necessarily seen as negative because you don't feel upset about their success. Rather, their success wants you to be just as successful. So that's not necessarily negative. But the problem is when it goes to a different extreme. When it goes to the extreme such that you want to be just as good as they and you don't want them to be good. You want to be the best. Then it becomes a problem. So that's actual jealousy then, when you can't bear it if someone else does better than you, and then there's unhappiness, there's discomfort, or there's dislike of this other person's quality. So actually, the best method to overcome jealousy is to rejoice in another person's success. Now that seems very hard. How do you rejoice in another person's success? I mean, like if it really bothers you, how can you sit down and instead of just thinking, it doesn't bother me, it doesn't bother me, it doesn't bother me, you think, I like it, I like it. It's almost like totally going against your grain. I mean, every grain of your body. But you know what's really funny with rejoicing? You can actually force yourself to rejoice and then be so happy with the rejoicing that you decide, actually, I prefer being happy with that person's success rather than being unhappy. It's different to generating love towards someone instead of anger. If you want to replace your hatred or resentment towards a person, then one method is to generate love and compassion. But here you apply reasons. Usually you apply reasonings, why it makes sense to love this person, etc. So then you can slowly transform the dislike towards that person and replace it with love and compassion. Jealousy is kind of different. I think jealousy is slightly different. It's like, yes, there's a certain quality that someone has, and we want that quality ourselves, and because this other person has it, we're jealous. Or it doesn't have to be a quality. It can be a thing, a material thing, a nicer house, a nicer car, a better job, I don't know, kinder children, or I don't know, whatever it is, right? Or more open parents, whatever. But the way to overcome that is to just sit down and to force yourself to just go, I'm so happy. You just say it. I'm so happy they have a nicer house. I'm so happy. You just force yourself to think, I'm so happy. It's almost like you're seeing your jealousy as some kind of, I mean, you're not the jealousy, right? Jealousy is just a state of mind. So it's just a state of mind that pops up every now and then. So don't identify with it because that's not you. It's not always there, and it just pops up when certain causes and conditions come together. So then see this kind of jealousy, I see it as some kind of ugly dwarf, popping up. Kind of like, I don't know, I'm thinking of like Lord of the Rings, that little guy that's kind of a little naughty. I don't know its name.
Golem.
Oh, Golan, yeah. That's kind of weird. So I look at jealousy like Golan, every now and then, I want it. So then I just rejoice. If I have a sense of jealousy, then this is so great. I pretend first. I just say it internally. It's almost like Golan, shut up. This person is doing so well. I'm so glad. This is so wonderful. That's really good. That's so good. I'm so happy. And it feels like Golan is like, kind of like pushed to the corner. And then he disappears. he disappears. And so she, my rejoicing, I'm kidding, but the rejoicing. So anyway, so the rejoicing then kind of takes over, and then you find, actually, why do I not rejoice in it? It's lovely they're doing so well, and you can really feel it. I mean, being jealous doesn't help in the first place. It just makes you feel horrible. And you don't get anything more. Rather, it paralyzes you. If you want to have the same as that person, achieve the same, well, if you're jealous, you're paralyzed, you're unhappy, you lose your energy. You certainly won't get it. But from a karmic point of view, rejoicing in the activity of another person creates the causes to get the same. So not only by rejoicing do you generate the energy, the joy, the determination to possibly achieve the same, on top of that, karmically you do. So yesterday we spoke, just a second, Varda. Yesterday we spoke about the importance of purifying negativities. So if you did the Vajrasattva practice last night, well, you have some taste of what it means to purify negativities. That's a very important part to progress in transforming the mind, to continue on and not face lots of obstacles. But another important way is to accumulate merit, accumulate positive potential. There are sutra quotes where it says the most important thing is to accumulate merit. In other words, like more capital, more kind of positive energy, whatever you want to call it, that enables you to accomplish what you want to accomplish. And one of the most powerful ways to do that is to rejoice in others' happiness. To just sit there, and whoever you can think of, whoever does something positive, who helps others, who is kind, who's compassionate, take those to mind and deeply rejoice. They say this is the practice of the lazy person. Because all you need to do is rejoice, right? If everyone else is doing circumambulation and prostration, doing all sorts of activities, working in hospitals, you can just sit and rejoice, right? So it's an incredible, powerful tool. Of course, that's not the only thing you're supposed to do, but it's said to be extremely, but it's said to be extremely powerful. And of course, it inspires you to do the same without dislike of the other person. And it's just joyful. I mean, come on, jealousy is terrible. No one feels good being jealous. You had an hour of feeling jealous. I mean, it feels terrible. So instead, you experience great joy. And it's extremely beneficial. It's extremely constructive. So therefore, from my own experience, I think instead of thinking, yeah, but it doesn't matter, they're better. I mean, all that reasoning, sometimes it's just like, it's just tiring. I just force myself. I just sit down and I go, no. And then every time the thought arises, I just go, no. So nice, so nice. And after a while, due to the force of habituation, it comes naturally. I hear about this person and I go, how lovely. And so you habituate yourself to it. So every time you hear about the success, you're sincerely happy for them, right? And there's so much benefit in doing that. There's just no benefit in being jealous. It's just, we don't even need to talk about the disadvantage of that. So I believe you can apply reasonings. Of course you can, but I don't even think that's necessary. And the reason I know this is that Lama Zopa Rinpoche once gave a meditation at Tushita some years ago. And it was in the context of a puja. We did a puja, a Lama Chopa. And at that time, we came to the part of rejoicing. It was part of the Lamrim prayer. And he said, let's just rejoice. And he made everyone rejoice for 20 minutes. And I was kind of curious, are people really rejoicing? So I turned around to see, and people were like, sitting there. And so what he did was first rejoice in the actions of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and think of what they do, the incredible actions that they engage in helping others. And it's easy to feel joy for that, how wonderful what His Holiness the Dalai Lama does, what His Holiness the Karmapa does, what Jadu Rinpoche does, what, all these great lamas, whatever they do. So rejoicing in that is relatively easy. And then you rejoice in people who are not great lamas, who are ordinary. And you rejoice in your own positive actions. Okay? And I was like, oh my God, I can do this for 20 minutes. without having to go through reasonings. So that showed me it's possible to just get your mind into that frame. Okay? Just when Gandalf arrives, no, it's not Gandalf. Gollum, yeah. So when Gollum arrives, okay, Gollum, just wait a minute, and then and then Gollum just goes away, because you can't have both. It's just a state of mind. Jealousy is just a state of mind that arises somehow and it takes over. So you can overpower it by generating compassion, by generating rejoicing. Just try it out. I mean, maybe it doesn't work for you that way. You may come up with your own technique. And in particular, when you're not jealous, just, you're jealous, but right now there's not jealousy with regard to that person. Do it then, because then the guy's not there yet, so it's easier to conjure it up. So when you're in a car, you just suddenly remember and you go, I'm so happy for this person. This is so great. May it even get bigger. May their success multiply. May it triple. And, it's like, whoa. When jealousy is there, it's like, don't you even wish for that. But you just force yourself, and then before you know, it becomes a habit, and you do it naturally. Okay? And it's possible because I've seen it with my own eyes. I'm saying this because the Tibetans are very good at rejoicing. They're very, very, very non-competitive, which is a problem sometimes. In their schools, they don't do that well because they're not competitive. They rejoice for those who do really well. Which can be an obstacle, This is why the Lamas often say, a little bit of competitiveness is good. Right? Especially if it's, of course, inspired by benefiting others, So, of course, there's some who work so hard, and oftentimes it's in order to benefit others. But if there's not such a strong sense, I want to do something for others, and you just rejoice, and you don't care about your own happiness so much, then it can be a bit of an obstacle. So Tibetans now introduce a bit of a competitiveness in the schools. But it's still, it's number one. Everyone claps, but everyone is really happy for number one. And nowadays, in the schools, number one, I usually... Pardon? Send them to Israel. Yeah. Well, in Tibetan schools, there are a lot of Indians who go to Tibetan schools. And Indians, their parents can be very competitive. So these days, number 1, 2, or 3 are always Indians. So anyway, they're working on that. But the point is here, we are the other extreme. And with the monks, for example, the monks and nuns, and I'm not saying there's no competitiveness and jealousy, but it's little. It's not a lot. And with my monk classmates, oftentimes it was so sincere. That someone did well, and they were like, "Oh, this is just so wonderful. It's just so good." That was their first thought. Even though I knew what this person had achieved, they wanted themselves to achieve. And because they wanted to achieve it themselves, when they saw someone else achieve it, it was like, that's so wonderful for them. Because it wasn't like, oh, if they have it, that harms me. There wasn't that perception at all. How wonderful. They got it. It's possible. Oh, how glad. I'm glad. How happy I am. Pardon?
It opens the door for them. It makes it possible.
Totally.
There's, someone you can ask.
Yes, exactly. So true. It opens the door to them. Of course, I mean, in so many ways, it opens up the door to, like this person, feel close to that person, be inspired, and maybe receive advice. Anyway, I don't need to say much about this, but the point is that I've seen it practiced. And, I mean, come on. If you can only rejoice in your own success, you're just one person. There's much less joy. If you can rejoice in the success of others, you have much more joy, much more happiness. Why? Because your joy doesn't just depend on your own success, it depends on the success of others. So much more joy in life, right? So like we talked about it yesterday, when sadness arises, for example, and you're not the only one. I mean, that's a common experience we have in the West. I had for many, many years. And then one way of overcoming that sadness is like, okay, sadness, please step to the side. All right, let's just look at all the great things that are happening in this country, for example. There are people who work so hard, they have such great ideas, ingenious ideas. So, okay, maybe they want to do it for money and so forth. Never mind. But we can separate that. the aspect of wanting to get money for it, because that's not the whole story. They also do it. They benefit others, whether they want it or not. But that's wonderful. Let's rejoice in this, right? There's so much to be happy about, okay? Anyway, so that's a great antidote to jealousy, yeah? So you have to work with it yourself. You may find this kind of forcing yourself to rejoice doesn't work, but nonetheless, try it out and see whether something else works for yourself. Yes, Varda?
It's a footnote, actually.
Yeah.
In Hebrew and in Tibetan, the word for jealousy is one. But in English, jealousy came later only for romantic reason, and the word is used mostly is envy.
Envy.
Envy is more
It's vaster?
all-consuming.
Envy.
Jealousy is romantic.
Uh-huh.
As much as I know, I searched it later.
In Tibetan, there's a word for being jealous in a romantic relationship, and there's being jealous or envy when someone does better than you. They're two words. So, mixelangwa is the word like if. What? Tato. Yeah, tato is the word like, tato means like when you're jealous when someone does better than you, when you're in a kind of competitive kind of situation. Whereas the other word refers to like in a romantic relationship, when you're in a romantic relationship and you're jealous when the person goes with someone else.
So actually you're talking mostly about the first one.
I'm talking about tato. I'm not talking about the jealousy when you're in a relationship. It's a little harder to rejoice. But you could still try, right? I mean, actual love would be, may they be happy, and if they're happy with someone else. But you see, one little thing, it's so interesting. I've shared this with you before. I'm a little chatty now, and I'm losing half an hour here. But one thing I've never forget, because I'm not good with relationships. I haven't had one forever, It's been so, I mean, not forever, but last time I was a teenager. So the thing is, what I've met this woman. Maybe some of you remember the story, whose husband whose longtime partner fell in love with another woman. And it was terrible for her. I mean, they'd been together for so long, but she decided to just practice the Dharma in this situation. She just was 100% determined to benefit him. I mean, to now apply in the situation that was as challenging as that, to apply what she had learned. So she lost a lot of weight. It was very difficult for her. But what gave her the strength, she was determined to practice. So she told her husband, please don't lie, or her partner, who had been together for 20, 30 years. So don't lie to me. Just be honest with me. Trust me. And so he felt like he could trust her, and he told her, yes, I'm in love with this lady. She was a Korean woman, or I don't know, an Asian, maybe a Chinese woman, and about his age. And they had met, and anyway, so he wanted to really be with her. But she said, don't make any secret from it. If you want to be with her, I'll help you. And she did. She literally packed his clothes, So like it went, he couldn't decide really. It was difficult for him. But she was like, 100%, I want you to be happy. You do what you need to do. And whenever he spoke of her, he would never speak bad about her. He would say, oh, that's lovely. I'm so glad that she's such a lovely person. It was difficult for her, but after some time, she could do it. She was able to do it. And she tried all the time to think, I want him to be happy. That's most important. He should be happy. I love him, so I want him to be happy. So anyway, went on for a few weeks, and it was hard for her, but it gave her so much strength. And then he left. It's the day he packed his things, and he left. And she was totally supportive. 2 weeks later, he was back. Or a month later. Because he realized, she had just let him go. She was totally concerned. Where do you find someone like that? It's not that easy. And this other woman was not like that, So in the end, because of her practice, she got him back, and he really appreciated her for what she had done. She had not created any trouble. Of course, he was wrong what he had done, but she was forgiving, she was understanding, she was kind, and she was open. And in the end, she got him back. It was so inspiring to me. So inspiring. I was like, okay, I'm not in a relationship. I'm not going to practice this. But if I ever were in that situation, I would like to practice this. So inspiring. So however difficult it is, short-term difficulty, long-term benefit, right? Anyway, so I thought that was very inspiring, how she dealt with her jealousy. Yes.
I use for jealousy, I use like another trick. I start with compassion. I started to like superimpose suffering.
Okay.
Person,
Ah.
like he got cancer, someone broke his house.
Ah.
I don't know, someone kidnapped his kid, whatever.
Okay. Okay.
And then like when the feeling is of poor person,
Yeah.
I think, well, at least he got a nice car. And
This is great. This is great. Let me say for those of you in the back who didn't hear maybe what she said. What's your name? Orit. Orit just says she has another technique that really works for her. So if there is a sense of jealousy or dislike of another person's quality or possessions, etc., she imagines this person experiences the worst kind of calamities. So someone takes away their house, their job, their children are kidnapped. What else? He has cancer, the worst kind of disease. And then slowly imagining that, there's a sense of, compassion. Oh, this poor thing, may they be free from, but at least they have a better car. At least they have, and then there's much more of a sense, yeah, they deserve it. Great, wonderful. That's even better. I need to remember that one. That's a good one. Yeah, it's very, you see, we just need to work with the mind according to, the tricks of the mind. The mind works in a certain way. So it's oftentimes, yes, when something horrible happens to another person, it's much easier because then it's kind of like all the horrible stuff, the little good stuff doesn't really threaten me. And then I can rejoice. Okay, anyway, just a few things about jealousy. I wasn't going to speak about that tool, but I thought it was important because it doesn't get enough credit. In the scriptures, you don't speak much of jealousy. You speak of anger and attachment. I think in the 21st century, more emphasis should be on envy, or like Rada says correctly, it's really better to use the word envy in that sense. So like envy or competitiveness, more emphasis should be put on that kind of negative competitiveness. Okay. But anyhow, so the point is here that with the different afflictions that arise, actions are accumulated. Karmic actions are accumulated. And they're accumulated at all times. At all times. There's never a time when we do not accumulate karma. Now, as long as it's positive, okay, fine with that. But of course, there's a lot of negativity accumulated, which potentially holds future suffering for us, which has the potential to lead to great suffering. Okay. Anyway, so therefore here the law of karma is discussed. And there are a few things I want to say about karma here. Well, first of all, usually a karmic action is complete when there are three factors. So one is a motivation. So oftentimes people ask right away, what makes a karma positive, negative, or neutral? Is the motivation. So a painful action, an action that causes someone pain, is not necessarily negative, because then you wouldn't want to be a dentist, right? I mean, dentists certainly cause pain to their patients, but of course with a positive motivation, and therefore it becomes a positive action, because of course they create short-term suffering for a person in order for that person to have long-term, absence of tooth pain, okay? All right, so therefore it's really the motivation that's most important. So you can engage in an action that seems positive, but it can become negative. If you practice generosity with the negative motivation, it's not generosity. Okay. So therefore the motivation is most important. Then there's the action itself. There is something about an action itself that can be negative. An action in itself can be negative. For example, the action of killing. So, again, if you kill someone unintentionally, that's different. But you have the motivation to kill, even to benefit them. Even if you want to benefit a person by killing them, it's still a negative action, because you have the wish to kill someone, and then you kill someone, that is in itself a negative action, taking someone's life. So euthanasia is a little complicated. But of course, an action is not always 100% negative. There are a lot of factors that come in there. So killing someone out of the wish to benefit them, to relieve them from their suffering, is not as bad as like killing someone out of hatred. There is some negativity, but there's the famous story, of course, of a bodhisattva killing a potential murderer, and the negativity was there, but it was so slight. It was the negativity, that the result of that was experienced for a few seconds, and the rest was just like the remaining positive karmic result lasted much longer. Right? So the negative result only lasted a short time. The positive result lasted for a longer time. So it's a mixture of things. But I'm just saying that an action in itself can be negative, but the motivation is still the most important factor. And then there's a satisfaction, there's a completion of the action, that once the action is done, if you regret it, then if it was a positive action, that is very much reduced or totally goes away. If it's a negative action, that happens too. So therefore, if you do have a negative motivation and you engage in a negative action, if right away you generate regret, the karma is very much reduced, and if the regret is very, very powerful, it can actually be transformed into a neutral action. Okay? So therefore, it's important, never regret a positive action. I'm reminded of like when people practice generosity. I said that yesterday. You give too much. Don't have the thought, oh no, I gave too much. Because then not only the money is gone, the virtue is also gone. So if you give too much, just go, okay, great, wonderful. Great one practice of generosity. Just rejoice in it instead of having regret. Okay. Anyway, so that's the kind of satisfaction after the action. Being satisfied with a negative action makes the negative action even worse. Being satisfied with a positive action gives more strength to that positive action. All right. And now there's a bit of an explanation if you look on page 70. It's a little complicated, this explanation, about what is physical karma, what is mental karma, and what is verbal karma. Now, verbal and physical karma is easy to understand. Verbal karma means saying something with your mouth, or I guess if you use sign language, that would also be a verbal karma, you could say. I don't know, physical, yeah, it's kind of a verbal karma, I guess. So if you express something by way of words or symbols, then if it's motivated by a motivation, if it's motivated by an intention, that is a volitional karma of the speech. And then if you engage in a physical action, I don't know, beating someone up, or I don't know, stroking someone, kind of giving them a hug in order to console them and so forth. Again, depending on the motivation, again, it's a physical action. It's a volitional physical action. So that's easy to understand. Now, mental actions are a little bit more difficult. When we talk about any awareness, whenever there's an awareness, there are at least 5 factors that are always present, called the omnipresent mental factors. So mental factor, another word for mental factor is just function, like a function. So with respect to a mental action, anytime there's a consciousness, you have 5 functions. One function is to make contact with the object. Another function is to engage in the object, or to pay, let's say, pay attention to the object, pay attention. Engage in the object. Discern what is going on. Discern with regard to the object, what does it look like, etc. And then having a feeling, having a kind of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral feeling. So those are 5 functions you always have. So whenever a mind engages in an object, the mind makes contact, the mind pays attention. Well, maybe first makes contact, then it engages in the object. It moves the mind towards the object. It pays attention. It discerns the object, and then there's a certain feeling that arises because of this object, so either a pleasant, an unpleasant, or a neutral feeling. Does that make sense? So those are called the 5 omnipresent mental factors. So contact, mental engagement, attention, discernment or discrimination, and feeling. 5. Contact, so make contact with the object, engage in the object, pay attention to the object, discern the object, and experience a feeling. Right? Those 5. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, these activities are there at different strength, but they're the potential to engage in those 5 is always there. Okay? So, therefore, when we talk about mental engagement, another word for mental engagement is volition. I've used the word volition here because that mental engagement, that ability of the mind to move the mind towards an object, that is called volition. Sometimes it's translated as mental engagement, sometimes it's translated as volition. So, both work. Mental engagement is a little bit more literal, but it'll become clearer later on why I've used the word volition. So it is that aspect of the mind that makes it possible for the mind to be motivated. So in a stronger kind of sense, it can lead the mind to be motivated in a specific way. All right? But it's actually just that mental factor that moves the object. Here it says it's the principal function or the mental factor of volition is to direct or move the mind towards an object so that the mind becomes involved with that object. Okay? That is called mental engagement or volition. And that is called mental karma. So if you, of course, you cannot separate any mind. Any mind has that function. So the mind itself creates karma because it has that function of involvement, has that function of volition. Does that make sense? So this volition we call karma, mental karma. So since every time there's an awareness, there's also a volition, there's a mental engagement, there's always karma. And a lot of the time it's just neutral. But if that awareness, let's say there's anger arising. So anger is another function, it's another mental factor. So it comes along and then there's an awareness being now associated with anger. And the volition, the aspect of volition here, that becomes negative because it moves the mind towards the object. It makes the mind, it is responsible for engaging the mind in the activity of dislike, of focusing in on the negative aspects of that person, the exaggerated negative aspects and so forth. So really we're saying it is because of that function, that engagement with the object, then other actions are accumulated, verbal and physical. So this is described, therefore, this mental function of mental engagement or volition is described as mental karma. Does that make sense? So we point our finger mainly at that function as being responsible for then the inducing or the production of physical and verbal actions. Does that make sense? So it's this mental factor, that's the mental factor that is mainly responsible, well, for engaging in the object, and engaging in an object then leads later on into other thoughts arising, and then planning, for example, to kill someone or steal something, etc. Yes?
Saying that a matter of volition means that there is a part of us that kind of chooses the volition.
Well, it's like part of us, the consciousness, part of the consciousness. So part of the consciousness, in the sense, choosing, as in like zooming in onto something, right? Kind of engaging in something. That's what the mind does. The mind has that ability. So that ability of the mind is called the volitional action, is the volitional mental action.